Welcome to Future Histories. My name is Jan Groß, and it is my great pleasure to welcome Aaron Benanav in today's episode. I very much enjoyed our previous conversation back in 2021 when we spoke about associational socialism and democratic planning, and I'm all the more delighted to have him back now, as much has happened since then. By now, Aaron has become an assistant professor in the Department of Global Development at Cornell University, and he recently published a highly anticipated two-part long-form essay series in the New Left Review titled Beyond Capitalism 1 and 2, which will be the subject of our conversation today. It has been a very, very wide-ranging discussion, I have to say, and we talked for over 3 hours, which is why I split the episode in two. And in today's episode, we'll mostly talk about the first essay, which lays the groundwork for a multi-criterial economy. The second episode will then take a deep dive into the institutional design of a multi-criterial economy and will be released in 2 weeks from now. There are a lot of episodes of Future Histories related to democratic planning, so if you're interested in the topic, please take a look at the extensive show notes where you will find plenty of material. And if you don't speak German, then there's a Future Histories International feed with English episodes only you can subscribe to. And also, just to have mentioned it, Patreon supporters have immediate access to the full conversation since I try to release the episodes early on Patreon as a thank you. All of the Future Histories episodes, however, are free and accessible for everybody, and the second part will be released as well, as I just mentioned, 2 weeks from now. I really don't like paywalls, and I have no intent and interest in creating them myself. But if you do want to support the show or simply can't wait to hear the second part of Aaron talking, then please consider supporting Future Histories on Patreon. It's greatly appreciated. And also, another way of supporting Future Histories, for which I'm equally thankful, is the wonderful practice of word of mouth. So if you like the show, please tell a friend or kindly recommend it on your favorite newsletter. Many thanks for that. And then one final remark, great news indeed. I am absolutely excited to join Lara Monticelli, Birgan Gogmenoglu, and Torsten Gielan as co-organizer of the SASE network Alternatives to Capitalism. For those of you who are not familiar with it, SASE is the Society for the Advancement of Socio-Economics, and the Alternatives to Capitalism network within SASE was founded by Lara and Torsten in 2017 in order to advance the international comparative and interdisciplinary study of capitalism and its alternatives. And as regular listeners of Future Histories will know, I am very much interested in the alternatives part of this, which is why I'm absolutely excited to join the network as a co-organizer. You can find our call for papers, submission details, and information about the Alternatives to Capitalism network in the show notes. The deadline for contributions for the 2026 SASE is December 16, and we are very much looking forward to reading your submissions. The 2026 conference will take place in Bordeaux, and I very much hope to see you all there. But now, please enjoy today's episode with Aaron Benanav talking about a multi-criterial economy beyond capitalism. Welcome, Aaron.
Thanks for having me.
It's a great pleasure. Aaron, your new work develops a framework for what you call a multi-criterial economy. Before we get into the depth of it, could you provide an overview of what you mean by multi-criterial economy?
Yeah, I think that is obviously one of the core concepts, and I've tried to make it make sense by distinguishing it from what I think capitalism is and how I interpret capitalism within my framework. So I try to say that capitalism is a single criterion economy in some way. And obviously, from a Marxist perspective, we would think about that as a profit-oriented economy, right? That this is a whole economy organized around profitability and where profit determines everything. I take profit to be a proxy in this case for efficiency. And when we talk about mainstream economists and Marxists or heterodox economists, they think about efficiency in different ways. If we think about mainstream economists, when they talk about how the society we live in is fundamentally an efficiency-based economy, and they think of profit as an organizing metric for that, they're thinking about an economy that, in every day is ensuring that resources are used as efficiently as possible to generate desired outputs. And it's not just this kind of static efficiency of ensuring we produce everything, as efficiently as possible, but also the inducement to innovate in ways that generate cost-cutting innovations like, the assembly line and container ships, but also innovations that produce new products. And so something I like about the mainstream perspective on efficiency is that it can really capture something I think Marxists are sometimes not as good at, which is that you can get efficiency gains either by cutting costs or by increasing revenues. Because ultimately what matters from this perspective is the efficiency with which we generate income from wealth, the efficiency with which we generate profit, especially from capital. If we shift frame and think about the Marxist perspective on that, Marxists would have a much more open understanding of what efficiency gains entail in capitalism, because the mainstream authors sort of assume that there's this legal framework that ensures that capitalists are only innovating in ways that are like socially beneficial, that generate useful product and process innovations, whereas Marxists and other heterodox economists would emphasize all of these other ways that capitalists can make profits and like efficiently generate incomes from their wealth that are socially harmful, right? Whether that's like increasing exploitation of labor, ecologically devastating extraction from the earth, all different other forms of offloading costs into society. These are all available ways for capitalists to increase the efficiency of their activity. But the point is to say that in some, bird's eye view, it's not true all the time. And I'm very interested in how, when we think about corporations and other kind of market cornering entities within capitalism, there's already all these ways that capitalist firms sometimes sacrifice efficiency to gain in other ways. So it's a really high level view of what capitalism is that doesn't correspond in every case to its on the ground manifestations. But once we have that perspective, we can say that a multi-criterial economy, or what it means to be multi-criterial, is to break free of this efficiency-first constraint of capitalism, and to get to a world where we can still take efficiency as one of the goals of the economy, but we can also take a range of other goals. We can say, we want to organize the economy around sustainability. We want to organize the economy around work quality, like making the work we do more satisfying. We want to organize the economy around, repairing, like going against the atomization of society to rebuild communities. And the idea here is, I always give those as examples because I think they're the ones that resonate really well with people. But what I'm really interested is the idea that a multi-criterial economy can really have what I call like end dimensions. It can be anything. Like we can take anything that could be a human goal, something that, people think is important, like our values, either important for individual flourishing or important for maintaining the bonds, our collective bonds across people. These are all like kind of values that we have, and they all could become criteria that could then shape the production process. And the idea, that's just the simple idea. Socialism is breaking with the value form, breaking with this single criterion system where everything is measured in this one term. And I importantly say it's not just that capitalism creates this universal equivalent. It's really that it's this efficiency first economy, that's the primary value that determines things. In a multi-criterial economy, we could have all of these different values serving as criteria for organizing our economy. And then mathematically and socially, that has all of these consequences that I think socialists in the past haven't really taken account of, and that really requires to think about what socialism is differently. But I stake that claim that the multi-criterial economy is like, more fundamentally what socialism is than some other definitions of the term.
Right. And I mean, you won't have to convince me that we are in dire need of such a multi-criterial economy, but there's, of course, also a broader populace to be convinced that capitalism won't cut it. And I recently had the pleasure of talking to Jason Moore, and he argues that capitalism is actually in a, what he terms, terminal crisis, since it's running out of what Jason calls cheap nature. And in the first part of your essay series, you also write that capitalism's very successes have generated problems that the pursuit of profit, as you just stated, isn't equipped to solve. So what are the material reasons for why capitalism won't be able to solve these problems that it has generated so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think Jason and I have slightly different accounts of what that crisis tendency is. I think for me, the core thing that I focus on internal to the dynamics of capitalism is the stagnation tendencies of the system. So I think that over time, capitalism is unable to kind of like autonomously induce the kinds of dynamism that, drove the system forward, especially from like 1870 to 1970, of this period of like really rapid growth, obviously Great Depression in there, all these, countervailing tendencies. But you had this really rapid increase in income in that 100 years. And that happened, I think, because of peculiar features of industry and industrialization. I think industry is a sector of the economy that is amenable to really rapid productivity increases. And so this efficiency focus meant that you could generate huge amounts of income growth and change just by focusing on efficiency and improving people's lives that way. When we industrialized agriculture, it had a similar kind of effect. But as we've moved to a service-based economy, and all around the world, we're now entering a majority service worker economy. It's not just in the wealthy countries. Actually, middle-income countries and low-income countries have also been deindustrializing, and their growth rates are really slowing down. In China, this also has already happened, but through government spending, they've been able to keep the economy growing at about 5% per year. But the point is that, as the economy moves towards a service-based economy, it can no longer generate the kind of like growth rate or, even from a more Keynesian perspective, it's sort of like unable to fully utilize its resources. It's unable to generate this like stable economy through an investment that has to focus on efficiency. Now, that's, I think, the internal dynamic, the stagnation tendency, the inability to make up for all of these deleterious consequences. Capitalism is generating so many bad consequences for, breaking up communities, super exploiting labor, like, offloading all these costs on everything I mentioned before. Those are all the things capitalism is doing. It's kind of trading away all of these other social values in favor of efficiency. But that trade-off used to generate a somewhat more stable society. Obviously, there was tons of resistance, but people could be sort of consensually brought into the system through the promise that, okay, there's all this horrible stuff that's going to happen, but we are going to raise your incomes. And I think that has that kind of social contract is breaking down, and we're seeing this repoliticization of society. Unfortunately, the far right is taking a lot more advantage of this social instability and stagnation than the left is, and that's part of what working on this project is I guess ultimately about. But obviously, within that, the climate crisis is looming, right, as a huge thing, and it's generating all these effects right now. But I still see that as something, that a lot of the reason for thinking in terms of this multi-criterial economy is to make space for sustainability and other goals. But yeah, I think that if we look around the world and see why everything is falling apart, to me, it's much more this slowing down of the system's internal dynamism that's generating all the crises we see today.
Mm-hmm. So we will need to go beyond capitalism, that's for sure. But you also argue that we need to go beyond notions of economic democracy that merely aim to transform the economy in order to serve the majority of people, what you call economic democracy for the people, and we will likewise have to go beyond proposals that simply include workers in the administration of the economy, what you call a limited economic democracy by the people. So why are both of these approaches not enough, even though important, and what are they missing?
Yeah, that's a really great question and something I thought about a lot, because I think that in the course of the 20th century, maybe there was a lot of focus on the idea that the problem with capitalism is exploitation. And the way people understood that was in a largely distributional sense, that, basically workers produce all the income and wealth in the world, and yet they only receive a portion of what they produce. And so, ending exploitation meant getting to a world where, workers control 100% of the social product. Now, Marx himself was already quite critical of this view, right? Especially around the need to set aside resources for investment. And we can talk about that later. But in a more recent period, already going back maybe to the 60s, we've seen this emphasis on the idea that, no, the problem with capitalism is more domination, that there's this domination in the system. Maybe it's not just domination by the capitalist class, it's also domination by capitalism as a whole. It's this abstract or impersonal or systemic form of domination that blocks us from having freedom. And I think that is basically right. But I think the problem is that, we've had this Republican revival that's really, I think, very important, that's focused on this domination side, the idea that socialism has to be non-domination, and that has something to do with freedom, enlarging the space of freedom. And I should say, it's very important that these efforts, like, you can read Bruno Leipold's book, Citizen Marx, is like a really great example of this, really showing that well into the Second International, you have these like explicit Republican views, and democratic Republican views in the socialist tradition. But I think if you look at that, what you'll find is that most socialists believed that, if we get rid of capitalism, we can produce a rational economy that's more efficient, actually. Like we can produce a lot more output by rationalizing the economy and having workers manage it. And the need for self-management in this case, or the Republican like non-domination critique, what it leads to for the Marxists especially is this idea that we should have administration at workmen's wages. So like average workers should serve this administrative role of organizing the economy. But mostly what people understood that to mean was that workers would play this role of like balancing labor across the different social activities. So like making sure that workers aren't exploiting each other because someone's doing more work than someone else. And so like, checking all the numbers and making sure they add up. Or, on the other hand, ensuring that there's no emergent bureaucratic class that ends up dominating everyone else. Now, obviously, these were really important concerns, because if you look at what happened in the Soviet Union, it turned out pretty badly. Like Republicanism would have been great in that case, because the bureaucratic class did emerge and there was this internal exploitation. But it's not enough, I think. What it misses, and I think for me this goes to the heart of the problem, is that a lot of the socialist tradition really understood the overcoming of capitalism as the birth of a new era of social harmony. Oh. And a lot of that is about this idea that, all we'll have to do is check. All the politics will be gone, and there will just be this administrative work of ensuring the absence of exploitation. And it misses, to me, the whole story of why we need democracy in a real sense. And it's because once we get rid of capitalism and the constraints that capitalism places on us, we're gonna have many possible futures we could head toward. And that's kind of for me, like a technical term, and we can talk about it more. But just that idea that, we will be able to go towards more possible futures. Capitalism sticks us into this one where progress means something like GDP growth. Progress means growing incomes, more and more efficiency, more and more products. But in a future without capitalism, a multi-criterial economy, we could head towards all these different, we could have progress mean many different things. And part of what I want to argue is that if we try to maximize all of our goals at once, like sustainability, efficiency, community, work quality, free time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, there's going to be different ways that we can compose futures from those values. We can't maximize them all at the same time. We're going to have to make trade-offs. We're going to have to make choices. And the real potential for democracy is to be able to choose across those futures, to decide where we want to head. That could be different locally, regionally, globally. We could think about all the different ways those things intersect and add up. But the real democracy we need is the capacity to choose across these open futures. And that requires a really different set of institutional, thinking about what socialism is very differently, because it means that there will be conflict in socialism. People will want to choose different futures, and there will have to be some way of allowing them to, engage with each other, try to convince each other to decide across these futures in spite of conflict. And so to me, that's when we say, why do we want democracy in the future? It's not just that we want to ensure that exploitation doesn't emerge again, or that domination doesn't emerge again, and that we have these administrations that make everything super transparent and ensure there's a rotation of the administrative, role across different workers. That's not enough, because it doesn't capture this open future and this need to decide across it. That's the real reason, in my view, that we need democracy. And I think socialists have had a lot of trouble figuring out exactly where to locate that democratic impulse. And for me, this is where we should locate it.
Absolutely. As a person who's running a podcast that is concerned with the enlargement of our idea of the future, I couldn't agree more, I have to say. So we have eliminated capitalism as a solution, for sure. We pointed out certain forms of economic democracy as not going far enough. There's another organizational approach that you engage with but ultimately dismiss as a structural alternative, and that is comprehensive central planning in the form of state socialist command economies. And you provide a very nuanced perspective of central planning, I have to say, emphasizing positive elements one should learn from, can learn from, and should learn from, as well as taking into account, for example, historical circumstances like the need to defeat Nazi Germany, while also criticizing the general structural problems with central planning. So this has been featured in Future Histories quite a bit, but not everybody knows about the critique of central planning. Could you explain why comprehensive central planning isn't the way to go either?
Yeah. And that's, as you said, it's to tell the story right, you have to give a detailed account and talk about the balance sheet. And I guess that for me, when I think about the positives of what they achieved, I think that a big problem with socialists thinking about the economy, and maybe we'll talk about this more later, is this that theoretically there wasn't that much focus on investment, on the problem of system dynamics. And I think that something really important about the Soviet Union is that in practice, under Stalin especially, they developed these 5-year plans, and there's no basis. No basis would be too strong a word. There's a limited basis for thinking that socialism would include this idea of 5-year plans if you look at the history of socialism before the Soviet Union. But in practice, they discovered this need to coordinate investment, and the possibilities that coordinated investment would generate huge increases in productivity that, that capitalism on its own, because it has to work forward, like capitalist industry, because it's uncoordinated, requires all of these actors to kind of feel their way forward together. And with coordinated investment, you can say, eventually we will produce all these things at the scale that makes them economically viable, but we're not there yet. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to build these massive plants that, produce electricity and steel and consumer goods. And we're going to build them all at the same time, because we know that eventually we'll get to the scale where these linkages are economically viable. A lot of modern technology just isn't viable until it reaches a very large scale. If people don't understand this point, it's become part of venture capitalism today. There's this thing called blitz scaling, and they know even today that like a lot of companies that they want to build, like OpenAI, it's just not viable. If it had started a small company and build its way forward by making a profit, it would never become what it is today. And I don't think it's going to last. That's a whole other part of my research. But the point is that these venture capitalists are willing to invest huge amounts of money in making this company go to achieve a massive scale before it has to make any profit. And the idea of central planning, or the idea of investment planning, is a similar idea, that we're going to build up this whole system and only expect it to be economically rational down the line. It's not just something that the USSR did. It was then developed by Japan and South Korea and China. So it's this huge advantage. But over time, the Soviet Union economy really slowed down. Now, the stagnation of the Soviet Union in the 60s is not the main reason to criticize the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was just like a horrible, authoritarian, technocratic society that was deeply oppressive and, murdered so many people. Like, there are so many reasons to be to look back in horror at what happened there. But if we're talking about the lessons, we're focusing on this, kind of economic component, at least to some extent. And so the stagnation of the Soviet Union, I think that as it generates all these problems, there's an increasing recognition in the Eastern Bloc that there's a need for markets. All of these Eastern Bloc countries, including the Soviet Union, only survive because there are all of these informal markets where where firms are exchanging goods and services in order to get what they need to produce. And, increasingly, there's a recognition that, we need to formally integrate these markets into production in order to be able to produce it all. Now, what's the lesson there? I take one of the lessons that we really need markets, and we can talk more about that later, I guess. But I think that the main reason is that I think a lot of people think that the problem with the Soviet Union was merely to do with the construction of the plan. And so a lot of this people who think that, the solution to do this better is to have central planning in the future, but to have it be done by computers. That if we could generate the perfect plan, we would solve the major problem of the Soviet Union. I think when you look at the details, what you'll see is that most of the problems, or many of the problems, had to do with implementation. It wasn't just coming up with a plan, it was how we actually implement the plan. And the problem is that a lot of producers were producing faulty goods or not delivering on time. And so when producers, received only a part of what they needed, they had to go out and find the other things that they needed. This is called the incompleteness problem. So maybe you get 90% of what you need to produce, but 10% that's crucial you don't have. And so you're not able to produce anything until you can source these remaining products. And so the need for markets was the kind of filling in and dealing with this implementation problem. It allows for sort of flexibility for producers to actually find what they need and ensure they're getting what they need. And markets also serve this role of quality control that, in a market, producers can reject delivery of things that don't actually meet their needs. They can go in search of other suppliers. And so it serves this kind of quality control function. It also means that producers can find the inputs they actually can use, not the ones that other producers in their industry can use. That's related to this so-called vintage problem, the fact that in the same line of production, producers aren't actually working with the same means of production because all these different factories and machines are built at different times. They get repaired in different ways. They evolve as they're used in different ways. And so, there's a kind of, Hayekian dimension to thinking about the role that markets serve, that only the local producers really know what inputs work best for them. But there was this kind of recognition that you need markets. And I think that led to the kind of quandaries of the late 20th century. Okay, given the failure of central planning and the apparent need for markets, what are we going to do? I should say one other thing I emphasize, when I think about the Soviet Union is the fact that in practice, they developed this multi-currency system. They actually had one a currency, the ruble, but they had a cash economy and a cashless economy. And a lot of the way the system actually worked was that these spheres of action had to be kept very separate. So in the cashless economy, it just meant that firms were kind of like given an administrative budget, and as they received the inputs that they had requested, those would be marked out as internal payments across firms. And so bureaucrats could see, what any given firm had and what transactions had taken place by looking at these non-cash administrative budgets. And then firms also received a payout of which they could withdraw of rubles for wages and other kinds of payments. That became the cash economy that was actually paid to workers. And so when we talk about the actual proximate reasons why the Soviet Union broke down in the 80s, it was because Gorbachev's reforms started to break down this like barrier between the cash and the cashless economy. And as that barrier broke down, it meant that there was all this cheating possible, and it led to all of these kind of foreign exchange problems for the Soviet Union. But it made the functioning and like administration of this centrally planned economy increasingly impossible. And that turns out to be important for my specific solutions, which also rely on having multiple currencies. So that's why I emphasize it.
Before we move on to your proposal and discuss it in detail, I'd like to engage with something you already mentioned with regard to capitalism, and that is efficiency, but now through a lens of democratic planning, because within these different traditions of democratic planning, efficiency, of course, has played a role as well. And I'm quite sure everybody agrees that efficiency considerations certainly have to play a role in post-capitalist economic coordination as well. We shouldn't be careless and wasteful with the materials that we have, not the least for ecological reasons. But a crucial question then is, of course, at what point and for what purpose efficiency considerations come into play. And even more importantly, one might say, we need to move away from conceptualizing, quote unquote, the economy as a closed system in which an optimization algorithm could calculate an equilibrium or optimal solution of some sorts. Could you maybe elaborate on the role of efficiency for democratic planning as you imagine it?
Yeah, so this is a difficult question for me, because as I've presented my work and talked to people about it, I've realized that I need to have a little bit more conceptual clarity around how I'm using the term efficiency, and it gets used in different ways. Because I think something very important, which you just mentioned, is that no matter what our goal is, we want to use our resources efficiently to get there. Like if we want to be sustainable, we want to be sustainable in the most resource efficient way. We don't want to waste resources on our way to get there. And so whatever our goal is, you could say we want to find like the frontier solution, like a Pareto optimal solution. We want to achieve whatever our goal is in the least wasteful way. And that's one way to think about what efficiency means. And it would be a goal, right, of any future economy to use its resources in that way. But the type of efficiency that I'm talking about as a goal within capitalism is really economic efficiency. It's the maximization of output or desired output or income from the investments that we make in that production. And so, when we think about a firm today, like let's say like Apple, the operational side of Apple, where they're producing all of the iPhones and the iMacs and the iPads, et cetera, they ruthlessly impose efficiency as a goal in those factories in China, right? They're trying to maximize the number of iPhones produced from the investments that they've made there. And what does that mean? We know that they sacrifice a ton on worker health and safety and quality, on environmental sustainability of production. They trade away all of those goals in order to produce as efficiently as possible. Now, what we could say from a kind of like static sense. So like, let's say, take our current technologies as given. These are our options for production. in a socialist future, we would probably want to trade away some of our ability to produce output in favor of other goals. So we would want, for example, we're going to have to give up some degree of speed of production to ensure that production happens in a way that's like healthy and safe and satisfying for workers. Also, given our current technologies, we might have to sacrifice some speed or volume of production for sustainability reasons, right? So in a moment, there are all these trade-offs across producing more and producing better in all of these different ways. And in capitalism, there's a lot of encouragement. Again, once we bring, brands and market cornering or market dominating like corporations into the story, they have more flexibility with this than suppliers in global South countries that are like pushed to the bone and have to really be fully efficiency first in the way that, this model of capitalism I'm describing works. But the point is that, with any given set of technologies, we're gonna want to trade off some of our capacity to produce more in favor of all of these other goals. And once we recognize that we have these goals and that these trade-offs are possible, we're going to have to recognize that there's no single optimal mode of production or method of production for any good we produce. There's a set of options where we have to decide how to combine our goals, how to combine the goal of trying to maximize the amount we produce against producing sustainably, producing, with good work quality, increasing democracy, whatever our goals are. There's no single optimal mode of production or method of production. Then there's additional dimension from a dynamic perspective, just to say this very briefly, that in capitalism, when we think about where research and development goes and where, actual investment goes in technologies, the profitability of investments is really paramount in capitalism. And what that means is that capitalists only invest if when they put capital into something, they get an additional amount of income from that production. So the investment has to be profitable. There's all these investments that can't access, which I call non-efficiency investments. So investments that purely function to improve work quality or improve sustainability, but don't generate any additional economic efficiency are sort of not taken by capitalists. But we would have open to us a huge range of non-efficiency investments as well as efficiency investments. And at the level of a firm or an industry or society, we would also have to choose how to trade off those different possibilities against each other. To some extent, we would want to continue to invest in improving the efficiency of our production in all kinds of ways. But we would also want to use a lot of resources to realize these other possibilities for aesthetic beauty, for sustainability, for work quality, for community, and so on. And again, once we have all these different goals, we find that there's no optimal pathway forward for society in these efficiency terms. And so at the level of the firm and at these larger levels, macro levels of society, we find that there's all these open possibilities. There's no single optimal outcome. And, we could talk about that more, but there's a reason why economics and even, socialist economics tends to think of the economy as like a constrained single goal optimization, where we're trying to maximize the amount we produce from the resources available to us given a set of technologies. And the reason is that if you take all the other things we care about, not as goals in themselves, but as constraints in the pursuit of efficiency, you'll see that there's generally a single optimal outcome that the whole thing organizes around. And then it's just a technical problem of figuring out what that optimum is. If you have two ways you could organize society that, result in the same efficiency that are equivalent in terms of this one goal, from the perspective of the system, it doesn't matter which you choose. But if we think about all the other goals that we could have as a society, those two options might actually be really different, right? They might lead us towards very different ways of organizing production and the outcomes of that, or ways of organizing the economy as a whole. And so I think that these single criterion systems can't take account of this larger set of possibilities, either for how we organize things right now or for the possibilities of where we go into the future. So yeah, I think that the efficiency is really important. It has these different meanings. And so by teasing them out, I'm trying to capture what specifically, I think it would mean in this case to like unfetter ourselves from this efficiency first orientation, and why socialists should not say, we're going to do efficiency first, but better. We're going to have a better optimized system, right? The point, in my view, is to break from that framework of optimization. It's not that I would describe mine as still an optimization framework, but because it's a multi-objective framework and or a multi-criterial framework, that optimization is always partial. It's trying to get you to that Pareto frontier, the way that all of your options that you could achieve without wasting resources across all of our different goals. But at that point, there's going to be trade-offs and different possibilities for organizing production in one firm and for organizing the economy as a whole and for, fighting our way forward into different futures.
And how does this thinking about efficiency and everything you just sketched, how does this relate to the broader notion of rationalization? Because it seems to me that what you are actually working on is a proposal for an alternative form of rationalization, one that not only argues against pseudo-rationality in its different forms, but actually wants to make a counter-proposal of some sort for an alternative rationality that you want to see in the world and in socialist proposals, no?
Yes. So I'm writing a paper specifically about this now, but I see what I'm producing as not a critique of rational choice theory only, but as an alternative rational choice theory. So it is, and here we could talk a lot about what rational choice theory is. It's not a description of how people make choices. There's no element of rational choice theory that's like an empirical investigation of how choices are made. It's really a kind of normative theory. It's a theory of what choice you should make, given the options in front of you, not how you actually make it. And a lot of people on the left, they criticize rational choice theory by saying, this isn't how people actually work. Like, this isn't how we actually make decisions. And within economics, this whole movement of behavioral economics has emerged around this exact critique of rational choice theory. They say, look, human beings just don't reason like this. And a lot of what they're showing, which isn't what the left would want to show, is that people, like, for evolutionary reasons, we have these heuristics for how we make decisions that lead us in all of these, to be irrational versus the standard of what they consider rational choice theory. Now, I think of what I'm doing as like I don't know if Neurath would accept this. Maybe he would be very upset to hear me say this, but I think it's a kind of Kantian turn within rational choice theory, where we say a truly rational choice theory also speaks to the limits of reason. It has to be able to capture the limits of reason as a tool, not just to kind of like imagine a world where reason can achieve anything. And so the idea is that once you think about the goal in this multi-objective sense, once we say we have multiple goals for which we're pursuing for their own sake, they're not sub-goals of something else. So, we want a world that's efficient, sustainable, has good quality work, free time, democracy, whatever. Once we say these are goals we pursue in themselves, they're not constraints or variables. They're what we're trying to achieve, the outcome we're trying to achieve. If you can't rank those goals, so that's an assumption of how I construct my rational choice theory, is that, we have multiple goals. They're not all utility, right? There's some set of goals we have that we can enumerate. In practice, you don't have to enumerate. There's this difference between the theory and the practice when we talk to the actual setup of the economy. But from a theoretical perspective, we say we have these goals, but we can't rank them. We can't say sustainability and efficiency, this one is worth 0.6 and this one is worth 0.4 and this one is worth, so on and so forth, ranked relative to one another, or put them in some kind of ordinal ranking. And so if we have these goals and they're incommensurable in that sense, we can't say how we would trade those goals off against one another, then what will happen is that reason will allow us to eliminate the sort of non-efficient solutions in the sense that you were using it before. Like reason will help us eliminate what they call dominated solutions. So solutions where they're worse on all the dimensions than some other solution. But at the end, we'll be left with an optimal solution set rather than a single solution. I give this example. I need to come up with a better one, because it's so bad. It's a fossil fuel economy example, so I apologize in advance. But let's say that you want to buy a car and you care about the safety rating of the car, you care about the cost of the car, and you care about the fuel efficiency of the car. So you have these three goals, and they're really important to you. You care about the sustainability of the car. Okay, leave aside all the critiques that cars will never be sustainable, but you are some bourgeois, like a subject, and you want to buy your fuel efficient car. You care about that in itself. You care about the safety of the car, and you care about the cost. These are independent goals that really matter to you, right? If you look at all the cars on the market, and you look at their cost, their sustainability, their fuel efficiency, and their safety ratings, what you can do is you can eliminate all the cars that are worse on all three of those than some other car, right? And that's the partial optimization you can achieve. You're trying to maximize all three goals, but there probably isn't going to be one car that's the best on all three. So what you're going to end up with is you can eliminate many of the cars you have available to us, but you'll be left with a set of cars which balance cost, safety, and sustainability in different ways. And so that's the idea. You can achieve this partial optimization, which is the elimination of all of the non-frontier solutions. But then what you're left with is a set of options that compose your values and kind of integrate the things that matter to you in different ways. And that final optimal trade-off, that's where reason gives way. And it's just up to you to compose your values in the ways that make sense to you. So that's kind of like, that's the basic idea here of this alternative rational choice theory. It's obviously comes from Otto Neurath's work on pseudo-rationality and rationality. The philosopher Joseph Raz also says that probably Neurath's drawing on the same resources, that ancient reason works like this too. That when Aristotle or other ancient thinkers thought about reason, they often thought about it as a way to eliminate bad options and separate good options from bad options, but they didn't believe that there would be a single best option, that reason could identify the one correct solution. It was more about eliminating bad alternatives and finding good ones. And I think that if you look at utilitarianism, it emerges with capitalism, right? It's like we have this idea that any choice we have, there's a single best solution, seems to emerge with and develop with the money economy and the kind of constriction of our ethical thinking that it brings about. So yeah, that's the idea.
Now, everybody wants to know how we can build an alternative economic, social, political system that is able to bring about these decisions between equally good alternatives in a way that doesn't result in endless conflict. So let's move on to your proposal proper. Could you maybe give us an outline of the institutional setup you developed for a multi-criterial economy as a start?
Yeah, so it's important to say at the beginning, because I kind of was a little bit maybe ambiguous about this in an earlier point I made, that a multi-criterial economy would be the framework for socialism, but not all multi-criterial economies would be socialist, right? So it's really important to imagine a multi-criterial economy here as a socialist version of it, as one in which we, have very strong supports for people, that everyone's raised out of insecurity, that it's a democratic economy. I think Neurath got into trouble with this sometimes. He kind of could imagine at times an administrative technocratic multi-criterial economy. And then later on, he emphasized more and more a democratic multi-criterial economy. I think that people really need to be freed from material insecurities, or just insecurities, social, psychological, and material, in order to be able to participate fully in a democratic economy that's making these choices. And I also try to emphasize that what I'm laying out is just a sketch of the institutions. I think there could be many different types of multi-criterial socialist economies. It's not like a single fixed system that has to be organized that way, because it's very open, but it could also institutionally, in terms of design, you could work it out in many different ways, especially the democratic component of it. All of that said, I think, as we shift from the kind of theory of this alternative rational choice theory to the practice, I also think it's very important that as we think about institutional design, the goal here is not for everyone to agree on their values and to enumerate what the criteria are. If you look at the existing set of ways of thinking about this, I think you could be misled about what I'm doing. So I want to emphasize that from the get-go. There's this framework from like Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, the capabilities approach, this kind of neo-Aristotelian framework that influenced or informed the creation of the Human Development Index, and now these UN Sustainable Development Goals. There's also the original thinkers who developed this multi-objective optimization frameworks also moved in this direction of what they called value-first thinking. The idea that all these people have is first we have to come up with all the different criteria that matter to us, and then we have to try to implement them into the system, right? Values first. My orientation to thinking about this reverses that, because for me, democratic politics is primary. And I think the key to democratic politics is that people are able to continuously debate about what their values are, what society's values should be, and how they want to compose and rank those values over time. So although the theory starts with this idea of what happens when we have multiple values, the practical instantiation of it does not require us to enumerate and agree on what those values are first. In fact, the idea of institutional design is at every level of the economy to think about structures and institutions that are going to surface these optimal trade-offs, that are going to surface our possibilities, whether it's our possibilities for consumption, our possibilities for production, our possibilities for association, our possibilities for investment. The whole system is designed to surface those possibilities and allow people to choose in a way that maintains coherence. Now, what are the institutions of that? Well, the first one that's really important is this, and I'll just lay this out in brief and then we can go into detail, is the split in the currency. So the idea that before capitalism and even in the Soviet Union, there was this recognition that to make these systems work, if we want to get away from a universal equivalent, we have to break up the functions of money and have multiple types of currency. Functions of money, we can use that term in different ways. I think I'm a little loosey-goosey and I use it different ways in different points. But the point is we have to break up the currency and have these multiple currencies. So in this one, there's a consumer currency called credits and a producer currency called points. And I get that from Daniel Saros, but I use it in a really different way. And there's like previous socialist history. I mentioned the Soviet Union example of the cash and cashless economy that was also essentially a consumption token and a production token. So that's one fundamental institution you need. There's no fixed rate of exchange between them. I could talk about how they interact later. Then you need, there's still households or individuals who are receiving these credits. They're also receiving some points because they have a role in funding associations that I'll talk about in a moment. So we have households or individuals that are making these multi-criterial, mostly consumption choices, but also associational choices. We have firms is another important institution in the economy. These firms are not like capitalist firms because they're worker managed. And part of what I try to explain in the piece is how once we have a multi-criterial economy, we can overcome some of the reasons for managerial hierarchies and really flatten our organizations. And there's all of this, again, it has this Hayekian flavor to it. There's all these decisions that have to be made at the firm level by these democratically organized worker firms. They could take many different forms. They could be small, they could be large, they could be owner operated, they could be all different kinds of sizes. But the key point about them is that there are firms and that they're managed by their workers, they're worker self-managed, and explain more about that. The next institution that's really important are these investment boards. So one of the things about the firms is that they're going to be using points. They're going to operate in this totally points-based economy. They're never going to touch consumer credits, even if they're consumer-facing, and that's where this interface between credits and points is very important. But these firms are going to be only spending the points that they receive in markets what I call operational points. So they're just used to pay rental charges for land, labor, and capital, and to pay for intermediate inputs. these points that the firms receive can't be used for investment purposes. They're limited to operational decisions. They also can't, this is the important point about the separation of credits and points, they can't take any leftover points and turn them into credits to pay themselves out. So they can either invest nor pay out. So there's no point for these firms in generating a monetary surplus. It's a surplus-free operational model. And then what we need is a surplus at the social level. So we need there to be resources set aside functionally for investment. And you have these investment boards that are then going to handle, as the democratic institutions, mostly on a sectoral basis, the investment needs of society. Not all investment resources are going to be decided in this democratic way by the investment boards. The boards could distribute some of the investment points to firms for repair to kind of avoid politicizing everything and minor upgrades. There's also these coordinating committees that are sort of like 5-year plan bodies. On one hand, more broad, on the other hand, more limited set of mandates. They function as like the coordinated cross-sectoral investment bodies. And then really importantly, there's all these civic associations, because this is a really politicized society. There's going to have to be, in addition to, material and social and psychological security, lots of liberal freedoms. This is going to have to be a society where you have the right freedom to associate, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and so on. And there's going to have to be all of these associations that are trying to influence and decide what kind of futures people should fight for. And so the way that works is that individuals also receive, in addition to their ways of getting credits, basic income, work-based income, universal services. That's how people get what they need. They also get a point disbursement that's equal for everyone that they can use to fund all these different associations that can then participate in the economy, not like firms that are producing something for social need, but as like all these kind of civic and political associations that need resources to carry out all of their different hobbyist, civic, and political goals, I guess. So that's my sketch of the institutional framework. I'm sure I forgot things because it's too complicated.
Don't worry, we'll get to it, I guess. That was our show for today. Thanks a lot for listening. If you want to support Future Histories, you can do so on Patreon. For this, visit patreon.com/futurehistories, or you can simply tell a friend that you liked the show and that he, she, or they might like it as well. Thanks a lot, and hear you in 2 weeks.